So now we've learned how to create JavaScript programs that can pull in functions that were written elsewhere using import statements. In this video, we're going to see how we can leverage imports to pull in some functions that allow us to write a web server. So a web server is just a program that specializes in responding to requests from elsewhere. That can be from another program on your computer or from a browser somewhere else on the internet. I'm going to go through creating a couple common types of endpoints, and we're going to see how these endpoints act almost like functions that another program can call to get back a piece of information from your JavaScript server. So with that, let us begin. So as always, my first step here is to go and create myself a file to put this code in. And the first line of my file is going to be importing the library that gives me my server functions. In this video, I'm going to be using one called Express. So Express is a library that allows us to create this concept of endpoints. An endpoint is just a name attached to a function that says, when someone visits this URL, here's the code that I want to run. And there are a couple different endpoint frameworks available in JavaScript, but Express is the most popular. There is something a little bit different about Express compared to the file system module that we looked at in the last video, and that is that I need to actually install this function. Unlike FS, Express doesn't just come with JavaScript. I'm going to need to go and download it, which I can do with bun install Express. You could also do it with npm install if you're using npm. But when I type this, it goes out, finds it, and grabs it. And now I have access to this thing. The main feature that Express gives me is the ability to listen to an port on your computer. So your computer communicates with the internet almost like channels on a walkie-talkie. There are thousands of these channels. And when I go and create my server, I'm telling my computer, whenever you hear something on a particular channel, this is the program that is listening for that and understands how to talk back. In Express, I can set up this communication by first creating an Express object that represents my server and all of the behaviors I can do to it, and then choosing that port number that is where I'm going to listen. For this video, I'm going to use 9999 because it's easy to type. By default, this is port 80 for HTTP traffic, or 443 for HTTPS. If you have a certificate that says, oh yes, I really am who I say I am, you can include that certificate and then listen on that HTTPS protocol instead of HTTP. I'm not using those ports because on some people's computers, low numbered ports like 80 require administrative access. You need to be the root user in order to bind those ports and listen to them. Or people might have other software already running on them. You can put any number here and it should work for you. But once we've selected our port number, I'm going to tell my app to listen on that port number. And this sets up the server. It says my Express server should be listening on that channel. And much like FS, this has a callback saying, once this thing is set up, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to say, well, the server started on some port number, just to give myself a little reminder that everything is up and running so I can see it in my log. And that's actually it. I've written those 5 little lines of code, and I have a server that I can get some responses back from already. So now let's see this in action. I can go ahead, run my program, and I'll get back that message that we printed to the log saying the server is started. Once I see that, I can actually cut over to my browser and view that website that we've spawned. In order to do that, I need to put something in the browser that says, hey, I want to go talk to myself. Normally, in the URL bar up here, we put some domain of some other website like google.com. When we do that, the browser goes out and asks another server on the internet, what computer is that? What IP address is associated with that name? And then it uses that to figure out where it's going. For our local server, we can actually skip that step. We could either put 127.0.0.1 here, or we could actually use a local host name, what's called localhost, which is just a shortcut that your computer has that says, well, I don't want to talk to some other computer. I'm actually trying to talk to myself. If we put that by itself, it's going to say it still doesn't know how to connect. And that is because, remember, HTTP traffic usually defaults to port 80. Because I'm using a non-standard port, I have to put one extra thing on here, which says what port I want the browser to listen to. I do that by right after the domain name putting a colon and then putting whatever number, in this case 9999. So if I go there, we can see I'm getting something back that wasn't that unable to connect error message. Suddenly I'm seeing a cannot get /. That's not a very helpful response, but it is proof that already we've got a server that is responding to requests. What I want to do now is look at how we can take this server and start choosing what our responses are. To do that, we're going to make a router. So a router is another Express object that specializes in connecting functions to paths on the URL. I'm going to do this in a separate file, just because that helps me stay organized. It helps me keep track of which parts of the server are where. We could do it all in one, but especially as your servers start to get bigger, I recommend finding convenient ways to split this code up. Here in my router.js, I'm going to start with an import statement, just like last time. And my import is going to import just the router part of this Express library. Much like the Express object, the router object is just created by calling the thing we imported as a function. And remember, this thing needs to talk back in main.js to the other object that we created. So I'm also going to need to export it at the end of the file here so that I can use this back in main. So now we've got our router object. I'm actually even going to wire it up now so that we don't forget. And I do that by back in main, importing that router object that we exported from // for the local folder and then that router file that we created. So now I've got the router here in main, and to wire this up to our app, all I have to do is say, app, I want you to use that router. And I'm actually going to add one extra piece here. I'm going to say specifically, when someone types in /API after the domain, so localhost 9999 /API, then I want you to use this router to figure out which endpoint they're talking about. Now that we've done that, this router can start registering functions to different subpaths off of that URL. As an example, maybe I want an items endpoint on my server. When someone goes to items, I have some database. My data here is an array in my JavaScript. If someone tries to get information from items, then I can say, router, when there is a get against this place items, here is the stuff that I want to happen here in this callback. And this works just like the callbacks that we saw before. For router.get, there are actually two parameters. a request and a response. And in this case, maybe my router is doing something simple. It's just saying, I want to respond. So I'm going to use this response object here, and the JSON I'm going to respond with is whatever is inside this my data. So this callback function that we've made works pretty much like any other function. When someone visits this endpoint, it gets called, and this response JSON is serving almost like our return. It's saying, once the function is over, here is what I am giving back to the person that made that request. So now we've got this endpoint registered. We've got our whole router registered to our app. Let's see what happens if we stop our server and then launch it again. So if I go back over to my browser, now if I visit this website /API to go to my router, and then I put /items to go to that endpoint we made, I'm no longer getting a cannot get error message. I'm actually getting a response. And if I click on the raw data, I'm getting an empty array. And the interesting thing about this is when I run my program, whatever is in this array here is what's going to be sent back to my users. So we can actually see this by changing up what is in our array. Let's say we're keeping with our example from last video. We've got some grocery store. And so inside our array here, we're keeping track of our prices of different things. Maybe I've got apples, maybe I've got bananas. And I actually want to return all this data to my user. Maybe on our website, we're going to be populating all of these little cells in a grid with these things. So I've got my data right here. Now, if I restart my server, pop back over to my browser again and refresh, now we can see all of that information is here in this array. In Firefox, it's actually really nice. You can see the raw JSON that you were sent. You can see it pretty printed to be indented, and you can also see it in this JSON view here that makes it expandable and contractible. I think this is great and a huge benefit when you're trying to debug these services. But you can also just look at the raw request, try to parse it out yourself. Now, we've written this endpoint, and this endpoint gives us the ability to communicate back information to our users. But that's only one half of the conversation in web programming. Sometimes we also want to make an endpoint where the user can send some information to us. So now we're going to look at an example that does that. Actually, two of them, because there are two different ways that we receive information when we're making an endpoint. The first is really easy, and it is this request object here. So maybe I decide I want someone to be able to get just the first few items. They can decide how many they want. And this thing, just like last time, has the request that they're sending me, the response I'm sending back. It turns out this request object actually sends us a lot of useful information. And one of the big things that it sends us is any query string parameters that the user input. So a query string parameter is anything after the question mark in the URL bar. And these things are usually formatted in the sense of, or in the pattern of question mark, some variable name equals some value. In your request object here, you actually get a request.query. Whatever thing that they sent on the left of the equals. So if I put request query count, I can pull out that information and read it here in this request. One important note about this is that just like when reading from a file, the only thing JavaScript knows about a query string parameter is that it was a query string parameter. So these things are all text. If you want a number so that you can do math or somehow algebraically use this thing, you're going to have to convert it yourself. But I've now got some piece of information from my user, and I can actually use that to decide what I'm going to respond. In this case, maybe I decide the data I'm giving back, I'm going to only take a slice of that data, starting at 0 up to the count that they gave me. I am only going to return in my response just that first few. Now I have an endpoint that isn't just statically relaying some information. If I've got enough things in here that we can actually see, when I switch back over to my browser and I call items, I need to actually also run my program. That is a good note, which is always make sure you are saving your file every time you make changes, running your server again. Now, when we come back over here, we can see all three of these items. If I switch to the first few endpoint, I don't get anything by default. If I first few question mark count equals 1, I get one thing. If I question mark count equals 2, I get two things. If I question mark count equals 3, I get three things. I now have an endpoint where this one function in my JavaScript can behave three different ways depending on the values that a user passed in when they visited that endpoint. You can think of query string parameters almost like function parameters. If our entire endpoint here is some function that we're writing for our users over the internet, then the query string parameters are the variables that they're passing in that can change what my function does. And that's very powerful by itself, but we can actually go one step further. So sometimes we don't want to use the query string. There are great things about this, but remember, anything you're typing there shows right up in the URL bar. So that's not going to be great when sending large amounts of data. If someone's sending you an entire novel, they've written an entire Reddit comment, you don't want their entire comment right there in the URL bar. That's going to be really nasty to work with. Similarly, if they're sending something that isn't really relayable as text, something that is difficult to represent as a string, like an image file that you're uploading to Dropbox, you can't really drop the image in there. You can try to encode it, but that's also pretty hard to do, something that we wouldn't really prefer. Similarly, when sending something sensitive, something like a password, we don't really want that password to be right up there when you try to log in. We want to at least hide it a little bit. When we've got a situation like one of these, we can actually use another function that's on our router. So depending on how familiar you are with HTTP, this word get might have been suspicious looking to you. So as we're going to cover in our next video, HTTP verbs are a second part that is attached to every request on the web. There are a bunch of these, but in particular, there's one special one that specializes in letting users submit this type of information. And that is what's called a post. So a post works just like a get. We're going to present some path, maybe in this case upload, and then we have some request and response. What makes a post different is that posts, in addition to having the query string parameters and the URL path, they've got one extra field, a request body. So we need to do something that lets us parse this request body. And the way I'm going to do that is actually with yet another extra library. I can import this thing called body parser from a library called body-parser. Just like with Express, we're going to need to install this thing. But I run bun install on that library, go out and grab it. And now I can actually tell my Express app, I want you to use this body parser and be ready for any requests that are in the format of JSON. And now, inside my router endpoints, I can use that response body exactly the same way that we used the query string parameters. So I go in here and upload, and I say, let the contents be whatever that request body was that we were given. Maybe I can log this thing, show myself what it is that we actually received as text, just so that we can make sure we can read it, because if it's JSON object, there could be anything in there. And if this contents has a name and this contents has a price, then I am feeling comfortable that this thing is a grocery, and I can say my data push on that new grocery that we've added, and then I can send back the response that your upload was successful. And if I've written something like this, I've now got some way that people can send me structured information that wouldn't be great as text. It would definitely be possible, but now we've got our different fields. I read that thing in, check that it does what I think it does, and then add it to my collection. If I run my server again, get it all started, pop over to my browser here, everything's still going to work the way it has. We still have our items, we still have our first view, but there's a little bit of a problem. When we've got a response body, I don't really have somewhere to put that up in the URL bar. I can't just go to upload and try to get, because when you visit in the URL, you're actually getting that endpoint. And like we said in our code, this new one that we've created is actually a post. So we're going to see in a much later video how we can create code in the browser that makes posts. But for testing for today, I'm actually going to use a REST plugin. So both Firefox and Chrome have a bunch of REST plugins. These are just tools that make it easy to test out very specific types of requests. The one I'm using here is one called Rested. There are dozens. Postman is also a very popular choice. But in here, I can type in whatever I want to visit, say HTTP localhost :9999/API/items. And when I send this request, we get back the same thing that we saw in our browser. The nice thing about this, though, is we also get our HTTP verbs here. I can say, I want to try a post. And as soon as I click that post, you might have noticed there's a whole big box here for us to put our object. So if I say I am uploading, and the content type of this is application JSON. So one important note about the post body, you need to specify what type of content you're providing, because otherwise Express won't know that it's supposed to use that body parser plugin we added. You just go into the headers and add a header here. In here, I can provide the body of this new grocery I've created. Maybe I've got durians that have a price of $7.95. If I send this request, it says, okay, I have added that thing. If I go back to my window, because we have that console log, we can see this is what it actually received. The contents of my post method have all of the details that I sent in that body. And the really cool thing about this is now, if I go and I request the items again, I've actually changed that array on the server. Because I pushed that new value into that array that lives outside of any function, it gets this new information persisted on it, and every single time I upload, if I add eggplant for another price and I send that request, now when I get my items, there is yet another thing in that array. I can actually create this interactive set of endpoints where people can upload things, modify things, read data that's already there, and create some persistent experience that does more than we could do with HTML and CSS alone. So that is endpoints. And in this video, we've looked at a couple different versions. We've seen simple endpoints that return information, endpoints that use the query string to fetch out extra pieces of data from our users, and then post endpoints that use a body to add even more context or larger bulk sets of information. In our next video, we're going to look at how we can think about organizing our endpoints in a way that's maintainable and easy to extend. So I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.